Okay, we're live. Hopefully someone can check on the channel and verify that that is actually the case and we're not just talking into the ether. This is one of the first live streams that we've done on Silicon Curtain, so you'll have to forgive any technical issues and of course the slightly late start there. That was all down to me and my rather obstreperous technical setup. I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan MS Pierce, who many of you will know, and Philip Ittner, who has also been on the channel. I'm delighted at least once, if not more than once. And if it is only once, then that's very rude of me, and we will fix that soon. Gentlemen, and you have electricity, I see. The fairy lights are back on.
Look at that. The fairy lights are back on to St. Olga, which is my litmus test as to whether or not I have power. We're not scheduled to have power, but darn those
power there is. It's a miracle.
Yes,
it's a Christmas
fantastic.
miracle. Well, before we jump into that, I mean, it's worth talking about. It's worth talking about the electricity issues. But let's just sort of announce what this is for. As many of you have seen on the community pages, we are fundraising to get some essential equipment. Ukraine. That is a series of trucks. It's quite a big fundraiser, and there are lots of fantastic YouTubers, as I guess we all are, activists, informational activists are taking part in that. And it's an ambitious campaign, but it's already hit a third of its intended target, and that's after only a few days. So there's a very good chance that it will meet the target. These trucks and vehicles, 4x4s, will be taken out from the UK, driven across Europe, and then they'll be fully serviced, armoured, painted, graphicked, and customizations added that make them suitable for the individual battalions that they're being delivered to on the front lines. These are life-saving pieces of equipment, no longer perhaps quite so important in terms of their frontline military role, but in terms of getting equipment to the front, getting wounded people back from the front. These are absolutely essential pieces of equipment, and it's something that the UK is very well placed to help with. Jonathan, I know you and Philip are also active in this campaign. How's it going for you?
Yeah, really well. I'm absolutely stoked. Not that it's a competition, Jonathan, but and Phil, but ATP Geopolitics is in #1 position. No, I really I got a bit of a head start from you guys, and my community is just incredibly awesome, and the team is we're almost we've raised for one truck, and I think we're 68% of the way through for the second truck as well. So we've got 16,800 euros done. So I'm just absolutely bowled over. And hopefully when that happens, if we can get to 20 grand sooner than anyone else, then I'll give myself a medal, and then hopefully the guys can help out, with the other ones that have come along, like your own, Jonathan. So that's the way I foresee it going.
As for myself, I put out a weekly interview, hour-long interview program on Sundays, and our last broadcast, our last edition premiered yesterday with Anna out in Kharkiv, who was a wonderful guest, and I'm very proud of that episode. But I did it as a live premiere, and so while I had been distracted previously by editing and putting it together, I did put it out on the live stream premiere, and that did give it a little bit of a boost. So, but I normally get about a 48-hour period before I have to start preparing for next week's episode. So I'm going to take advantage of that today and tomorrow to push it forward, and I hope to get more money. But Jonathan, buddy, I don't know if I'm going to catch you. That's pretty good. I'm impressed.
It's all for the right. I merely jest about any competitive element. Of course, it's just amazing. We're all in this together, and it's just phenomenal. Really, really cool. And what's interesting as well is that each of the different channels have different units that they're fundraising for, and they put together a video for them, and you can see what the different vehicles do. So with our two vehicles, the first one was a kind of a mini HIMARS, they call it, a mini MLRS with 3 or 4 tubes on the back, and they kind of. I showed some pictures of this today in a video of them in the workshop working on that, and then the second one is for supplies and ammunition. Is just more of a bog standard truck. So it's great that there are these different variants as well, for depending on what the needs are.
Yeah, and I found it interesting that the coordinators of the project, kind of reached out to me and said, "Do you think your audience would, non-lethal or lethal?" And I said, "No, lethal's fine."
Yeah, funny enough,
I have no problem.
I had that exact same question, and my thought process was at the beginning of the war, I would have gone non-lethal and tried to. Yeah, I think I would have made that decision. But now I'm of the mind that the quicker Ukraine get weapons, the quicker an ending to this war comes about that is favorable to Ukraine. So they just need more weapons, and it sounds counterintuitive, but it's like weapons are the way that you get peace. Peace through strength, I guess.
Yeah,
and it's a good story, aren't we?
Yeah, well, and I lost a lot of compassion, and I don't mean that intentionally to sound cruel, but I lost a very dear friend here. I've seen, the death and destruction, and I got to a point where I was just like, if you are a Russian soldier in a Russian uniform carrying a weapon on Ukrainian soil, I'm sorry, I can't. I have very little compassion for you. You can always drop your weapon at any time and start marching east. It's perfectly, that's a viable option. But if you're participating in this, then
screw
what you're doing to this country, I'm sorry, I just can't. Yeah, screw you.
And there's lots of,
and I've been in a few wars.
Lots of charities have popped up. Yeah, I mean, there's been loads of charities popped up, and we had an event focusing on drones at the Ukrainian Social Club in London a couple of weeks back, and the team there are fantastic. So there's a British academic and also Ukrainian team, plus a sort of Swiss American guy out there called Noel, and they're doing a tremendous job. But originally, one of the charities, he was evacuating animals to the front line. The British academic Arthur Wordsworth and her colleagues there were doing a charity rebuilding houses around Kharkiv that had been damaged, in the first time round. It's fantastic charity, but of course, what started to happen is the houses that they've repaired are being hit for the second time, and at that point, I think they flipped to now we're going to flip to drones. So we've gone from
I didn't know she'd
very
done
very
that.
noble, peaceful intent to Well, that's still going on, but I think the main fundraising efforts are now through sort of crowdsourcing drones and building that kind of cottage industry. They've got incredible things, like they've got these little wooden tables where you can slot the parts in, and in a couple of hours you can actually teach people to assemble those components, and you've got these fantastic little molds that you can fit the parts into to make it easier for someone who's doing it for the first time.
Oh, wow.
And I think they've kind of realized that defending the country is the number one priority. Rebuild, yes, where you can, but generally, it's about security before reconstruction in many avenues.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I interviewed her on my show once. I should get in contact with her again because she's absolutely great, and was doing fabulous work with that rebuilding. But I get that fully, which is you have your order of priorities, and this is you can actually expand that out to international conversations between state powers, where you've had these conferences on rebuilding before you've worked out a pathway through Ukraine winning or prevailing or whatever the outcome is going to be in this war. And it's like, no, that will come. Okay, you might want to put some bricks down and foundational bricks for that, but really we should be working right now on throwing everything we can at Ukraine winning this. This has become a global game of risk between two players now, and it's essentially Ukraine and its allies against Russia and its allies. And there, yes, obviously we've got Iran, North Korea, but I think China and India are to do with that. We've got a movement of the economic focus of Russia from looking westwards towards looking southwards and eastwards, and I think that you know, the US needs to make a decision whether it really wants to back Ukraine to the hilt, because actually its own economic and hegemonic future relies on the outcome of this war. And I think we're at this inflection point, and we need to make the decision whether we are going to fully go in on this or not. And it's a bit 50-50 from what I can see.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems has been fear of the orange man getting back in the White House. And I think the Biden administration, for a variety of reasons, I don't think is exclusively the reason why he dragged his feet. You know, Jake Sullivan was in there as well, and all the rest of it. But I think at least part of it was the fear that if there had been escalation, that it would provide political capital for Trump. Well, you know, irregardless, or, you know, whatever, Trump won anyhow. So folks could have been, you know, Biden could have been flooding the zone with weapons and lifting the restrictions on the weapons regardless. But I think a big chunk of why the U.S. was reluctant, because they were afraid of giving Trump a talking point on the stump. That, you know, having been said, you know, that's we're past that now. So I'm hoping that you know, all these packages that we see, and I think just in the last 24 hours we saw another 500 was it 500 billion million, sorry. Anyhow, you know, I keep fumbling on that word. Still, it is long overdue that they do. And I've spoken to some of my military contacts, and a lot of folks have been saying that once the ball starts rolling with military logistics, it's rather difficult to halt it and reverse it. So, you know, artillery, you know, the Patriot supplies, ammo supplies, HIMARS, these things can be put on planes and sent very easily. And Trump, even if he would want to, may not be able to put them on return flights. It might be more difficult to do that. And then, of course, the heavier stuff like, you know, Bradley fighting vehicles or Humvees or MRAPs or the, you know, actual weapon systems, those need to be put on ships. And again, the Biden administration does seem to be focusing on, or not focusing, but seems to be ramping up, physically putting these things on ships. And once they're in the European theater, it's going to be very difficult for Trump to reverse it. Not impossible, but very difficult. That's what my military contacts are saying to me. So even though I do fear that Trump is going to, you know, vastly diminish support for Ukraine, I think the stuff that the Biden administration can get in the system and get moving, the better, and hopefully continue to, you know,
interesting that Dmytro Kuleba, the former foreign minister, came out in the last 24 hours and said he thinks it's unlikely that Trump will be able to affect a deal. He just doesn't think that whether that's like Ukraine or Russia not wanting to do the deal or both. And he doesn't, I think he said something about not thinking that he would cut aid. I mean, I don't know. I'm just so up and down with trying to second guess what Trump will do. All I can be sure of is that in Trump's own head, he is effectively anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia. If he supports Ukraine, it will be almost not accidentally, but it will be a changing of his mind, and it will be informed by or enforced by people around him. But many people around him are of that same kind of mindset, unfortunately. So we'll just have to wait and see.
There are some interesting developments, but I'm like you, Jonathan. It's difficult second guessing, and a lot of the noises of people that are surrounding Trump, of course, are
exactly
an echo chamber for Russian propaganda. But you know, what influence are they actually going to have within I'm going to call it regime itself? You know, they're going to have their titles and their status, and they're going to get yanked onto Fox and whatever. about how much decision-making power they're going to have. I mean, that is questionable. And I think there's an interesting trend behind the scenes, which is to suggest to Trump what enrichment opportunities may exist. And I think a figure at the weekend was something like $11.5 trillion worth of rare earth metals, minerals, assets, stuff you can dig out of the ground. And I think there are some people just trying to penetrate that Trump circle saying, look, let's create some opportunities here. It may be that the US would then put not a block, it would put a sort of first refusal on a whole load of stuff to make an absolute fortune, which of course is painful for Ukraine. But if Ukraine, as a democratic country, is able to find a way to channel that wealth down, not to a handful of corrupt individuals as happens in Russia, but down to the broad population and investing in a diverse economy, it's not necessarily a bad thing to come to some kind of deal with the US on mineral reserves. That might work. Who knows?
Ukraine knows this though. Like, they'll be wargaming and strategizing everything, and they know what kind of person Trump is. So the kind of narcissistic, egomaniacal, strongman wannabe, right? So you just play to his sense of hero-ness, which is okay. And this has already happened. So the news came out yesterday that Ukraine has delayed twice a trade deal with the US so that Trump can sign it. And which is fascinating. So this is a trade deal that would, I don't know what it's to do with, whether it's rare earth metals or whatever, but some kind of big deal. No, we're not going to sign. No. And the Biden administration will know this, and Zelensky will know exactly what's going on there, which is if Trump can sign this, he looks like a hero. He's bringing in that money to the US as a result of that trade deal. And then that will give him a permission structure to continue giving aid to Ukraine, potentially.
Well, I'm of the mind, firstly, I'm of the mind that Trump is compromised by Putin. And I know there's lots of stuff that swirls around that. But having seen Russia's interference in other countries, which they always do with their near abroad, and their political, and information warfare campaigns, were almost, perfectly mimicked from other, as I say, near abroad states when the 2016 election happened. That is my personal opinion. He's compromised. But having said that, let's also flip it on the other side of the equation. And when it comes to Russia, can Putin accept a ceasefire at this point? 23 to 25% of his entire economy is wrapped up in the war economy. And he has hundreds of thousands of soldiers mobilized. So what happens if there is a ceasefire? Will he demobilize those soldiers to send them back to their little podunk towns in Siberia where there will be no jobs, because he's going to have to try and then transition back to a normal economy and still have sanctions on him? What are those young men who have just returned from war, hundreds of thousands of them, going to do when they return to their homes and there are no jobs? Are they going to continue paying them a pension or a military salary? How does he get out of a war economy and deal with the demobilization of hundreds of thousands of his own people? He's kind of caught in a catch-22. So he may also be looking at this and going, maybe not right now a ceasefire, because we're all set up for war. And can we extract ourselves from war, economically, and also deal with the ramifications of a lot of men in uniform with guns?
I think we have the answer.
I mean, presumably those guns would be taken.
Yeah. I think we've already got the answer to that one. I mean, first of all, I want to call out Julian, who's made the comment of the day so far there. If they unearth a rich seam of bronzer, then Trump will be right after that, and he's very generously helped with Fundraiser. If we want to get those trucks in, we'll talk in a minute, Jonathan, about how those are going to get over to Ukraine, because I think that is quite an interesting conversation. But I think there, Phil, you're right, but we have our answer already, because whereas the Wagner criminals are allowed back into their hometowns because these guys are not political. It's quite clear what most of those are after. So you can let them back into their hometowns to commit mayhem and violence. That is not what Putin is scared of, random, gratuitous violence against Russian civilians. He doesn't care about that. But the Kontratniki, and the mobilized people who are not necessarily criminals, at least were mobilized when they weren't criminals. He fears these people coming back. They are not let out of Donbass. I had this conversation with Ilya Ponomarev, who's the nominal spokesman of the Russian Free Battalions. And, I think we came to the conclusion that what Putin has created is an outsourced gulag in open sight. These guys are not getting out of there. And if Putin's ever pressured to bring that 800,000 or 1 million strong army home, I don't think he will. I think he'll transfer them to the next war zone. And we've got to ask ourselves, well, what's that going to be? Is it Armenia? Is it Azerbaijan? Is it Central Asia? Is he going to pack them down to Georgia if
Africa.
The unfolding Georgian Maidan works? That, unfortunately, I think, is the scenario we're going to see. And the West will be less inclined to support these countries even than they are Ukraine.
I was listening to and I listened to the full 2 hours this morning of an interview of Willie OAM. So I know Willie OAM, some people are saying, he's gone a bit, pro-Russian, etc., etc. But he had a very good interview of an economist, Connolly, who's worked with RUSI, Royal United Services Institute. And sounds like there's some police near someone. And it sounds, and that interview was fascinating, and it was a bit of a corrective in terms of the Russian economy is far more resilient than people think, and it has deep pockets, but it's also used to these things. It adapts. It's got a fairly, compliant population, and that actually people worry that it's on the precipice of collapsing, but it really isn't. And actually it could manage to sustain the Russian war machine for a lot longer than many analysts had given credit for. And the sanctions, while they are hurting, as long as the price of oil remains fairly high, Russia's fine to move its economy from one side of the world to the other. And it's fine not to take all these dollars, because actually that will hurt the American ability to keep its economy going, and its dollar at the top of the table, so on top of the hierarchy. So there are loads of complex things to talk about with regard to the Russian economy as it sits globally, but it is just much more resilient than people think.
Yeah, I'm no economist, so this is not a hill I'm going to die on. But I just found it. I do find it interesting, having spoken to people who are far more knowledgeable about this than I, that having put the country on a war footing and a war economy, and to have this mass mobilization, you're absolutely right, Jonathan. He doesn't want those guys coming back. I mean, you only have to look back into Russia's history. The Decembrists, for example. I mean, having a mobilized Russian group of manpower suddenly come back into Russia itself, and make demands for reforms or whatever. But then also, yes, does he just keep the war economy going and pay those guys off so that they're placated? I don't know, but it's not as simple as everybody sits down around the table and we hash it out. And there's a lot of people have a lot, and this is the sad thing about war is that it does get entrenched. It does get, even to the point of, there are people who benefit from war. So I don't think we're quite there with Ukraine becoming like a source of income, although I'm sure that is happening. But these guys are going to have. These guys are all of them, all participants in this war have their own focus and their own agenda, obviously. And so I don't see, sadly, a ceasefire process getting off with any, inertia, despite what Donald Trump seems to think.
Can I just add something Aussie Bugger has just said, a very important point on the economic argument side of things, that Russia has no foreign debt to service. There's no, in fact, in terms of debt in general, they're in a very good position. And this is something that, US racks up lots of debt, but it's okay because loads of people are happily using the dollar, and that keeps it able to do that. I mean, I'm no economist, so I don't fully understand the ins and outs of this, but Russia is in actually a pretty decent situation with regard to debt. Anyway.
It's interesting because I'm in various chat groups that share Russian language materials on the state of the Russian economy, and some of the indicators are that things are pretty dire, and that the military-industrial complex is creaking at the seams, and that certain supply depots are starting to run out of that Soviet-era stock. And I've always thought, since 2022, when it became clear the West was sort of eking out support in dribs and drabs, and we can argue endlessly about the reasons for that, I tend to feel that it was more strategic, actually, than it was a mixture of it not being the main priority, etc., etc. But I rather fear now an element of it was strategic in eking that out. But it seemed at that point, if we weren't going to give Ukraine everything it needs to absolutely trounce the Russians, which could have happened on various occasions in late 2022 and 2023, then this was going to be a race to see who crumbled first. Was it Ukraine with Western backing, or was it Russia down to its own internal contradictions, brutality, inefficiency, etc.? I feel that, if we'd even, been 10, 15, 20% more energetic and efficient in supplying Ukraine, then Russia may well be in the stage where it's actually crumbling on the verge of collapse at this point. The very fact that it isn't kind of suggests the strategy has partly been to prevent this so-called collapse of Russia. There are many, many levers we could have pulled and could pull at any time that would literally sort of drop the floor, if you imagine sort of execution chamber with Putin strung up by his own noose. But we've chosen not to pull those, or at least we've chosen to just gently test those levers to see what efficacy they have. If we would have pulled them suddenly, I think I used this comparison in an interview last week as like a handbrake, we could have ended this. So I think it's a conscious choice not to do that. An oil price, which you mentioned, John, is absolutely one of the key ones, because you saw the Soviet Union essentially start to fall apart, not just because of Afghanistan and foreign adventures, but because of the drop in oil price. It's an extraction economy, and if you take the bottom out of those prices, they're done.
Yeah, it's a really important thing. Like, getting the price of oil down would be one of the biggest impacts on Russia's ability to prosecute the war. I mean, you've got three elements. You've got boots on the ground. This is for both sides, right? And for both sides, I mean, the entire, all the allies of Ukraine, and all the allies of Russia and Russia. So you've got the first element is boots on the ground. Like, who crumbles first in terms of access to people. And then the second one is stuff like weaponry and ammunition, military equipment. And the third one, which can underwrite that second one with industrial capacity, is the economy and money. And it's a game of kind of chicken with all of those three things, where they're trying to spin plates. We're having all optimize all of these three things. You need your economy to underwrite your industry to make as much stuff as you can, or you need your allies to do that, and you need as many people as you can, or you need your allies to provide, or you go and get mercenaries, or you clear out the prisons. However you do it, those are your three elements, and it's who's going to crack first, like Ukraine and its allies, or Russia and its allies.
Well, yeah, and I've seen it posited by far more intelligent minds than I. That the fall of Syria also may be a significant factor in changing that, because if you can get Syria to stabilize in such a way that they're friendly to outside investment, and the West kind of opens up to them. There is now no obstruction if, again, Syria stabilizes in such a way to build a direct pipeline from Saudi through Western-friendly Jordan into
Qatar,
Syria, and that would, you don't need to rebuild Nord Stream 2. You don't need to. You can directly pipe from Saudi and Qatar up into southeastern Europe, and that would then allow Europe to change drug dealers from Moscow to the House of Saud, which I'm not thrilled about.
Yeah,
but I'm far more concerned about Putin. But then I have skin in the game.
And at the same time, Syria is a waypoint to the Sahel region of Africa and all regions of Africa where Russia have, again, skin in the game, like you say. So Syria could end up being an incredibly important part of this. But then that's long-term thinking. I mean, when you've got Trump coming in and saying, right, we're gonna get negotiations done ASAP, you're thinking, well, that pipeline's going to be built and this is like 2026 or whatever, so it depends on what kind of timescale we're thinking about here. But
well, I think this is a good point here from Talking Bloke, and I think Trump may not be intrinsically friendly to Ukraine, but he may either consciously or even inadvertently enact policies that screw Putin up really badly. And one of these could be forcing a drop of oil, because this really is talking to his base. This is one of the things that really attracted people, I think, to Trump. Yes, there are people who are attracted to the more sort of misogynist, racist nonsense that he comes out with. But I think most people who voted for him are voting for their pockets. They're voting to feel richer. They're voting for more financial opportunities. It's a big motivating factor. So he's going to, if he's going to actually enact that, one of the easiest and simple ways is to get fuel prices lower, to get the cost of fuel to industry lower, which reduces the price of goods. Now, he may also, and it may not actually work out that way in the US, because even if you lower fuel prices, that's going to screw Putin, which is fantastic. But he's introduced potentially a ton of tariffs against China, which of course is going to increase the price of consumer goods. He's going to potentially deport and block vast amounts of migrant workers coming in, which of course is going to accelerate price inflation for a whole variety of staples. So whether the people who voted for him actually experience any of these benefits or not, I think he will at least try to drop the price of oil. It may be that Saudi and others in OPEC preemptively do that, because here you've got a sort of whimsical proto-dictator. Well, what do you do if you're a middling country with certain aspirations and you don't want to get on the bad side of this guy? Well, you make certain gestures. You give gifts to the Tsar, as it were, or you come up with your Danegeld or your Trump Geld, as it were, because we know he loves to cover everything in gold, shiny stuff. So we may well see sort of preemptive drops in oil price, the way we're seeing other preemptive noises around other aspects of economy, trade deals, all this kind of stuff. This could be really interesting. Of course, we've got to remember as well, as Jonathan said earlier, a lot of oil is going to China, a lot of oil is going to India. They're getting rupees and yuan in return. Not massively useful, but at least if you've got you've got your ruble collapsing, it may not be the worst thing to hold currency outside of ruble. Except that if massive trade tariffs imposed on China, that could cause some fairly significant devaluation of the yuan and instability with China. Well, that could doubly screw Putin up. Not only will China be less concerned perhaps about what's happening in Russia as it tries to tackle this deteriorating relations with the US, it may be that Russia's holdings of currency for all that lovely oil that it exported starts to devalue in a significant fashion. So I think Trump could inadvertently make a real mess of Putin's plans.
He could, but there are three issues to consider here. One is that the US has already drilled, baby drill. So the US is pumping and producing more oil than any other country in the history of the earth, right? And so the idea that Trump can come in and say, drill, baby, drill, they literally, like, how much more capacity is there to do that? And I think this is a bit of a misnomer, because he's talked about the Keystone Pipeline and the whole idea that Biden's been all too environmental. Biden has put in environmental legislation in with the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, sorry, and he's done loads of that stuff. But at the same time, they've been pumping an absolute ton of oil. The other thing they did was release loads of strategic reserves some time ago, and the Biden administration done a very clever thing, which is they flooded the market, kept the oil price down, which actually helped screw over Russia. But at the same, then they bought back, they played around with the price of what oil was, and then they sold it when it was high and bought it back when it's low, and actually made some profit on buying and selling oil to refill the strategic reserves. But the larger point is they're already doing that, and I'm not sure what extra capacity Trump can eke out the system. The other thing is that you can't really tell private companies to pump oil. Like, they are private concerns, so I don't know how, like, those concerns are not going to want to flood the market if it brings down the price per oil, knowing that they've got finite resources. So you'd rather drill less, export less at a higher price than export more at a lower price if they get you to the same place. So I don't know that it's as easy as one might think with Trump saying drill, baby, drill. I don't think he necessarily has the key to the US drilling more. Like, I don't know enough. I don't know whether he can just tell them to drill more, and like BP and Chevron to go, all right, then yeah, I'll just do what you say, even though it's not economically optimal for us. And a third issue to mention is that the tariff situation with China, and especially if he goes against BRICS, he's talked about going tariffing BRICS. This starts getting pretty interesting, because you might get a situation where he tariffs BRICS and it ends up being far worse for the US than it is for the nations he tariffs. And also it starts pushing BRICS and or non-America into using far more other currencies for international trade. So the more that the US tariffs India and China, the less the US is going to buy from India and China. And that might sound really great. Yeah, the US then brings up its own economy, but then you're not seeing this transfer of the dollar as an international currency. And then you start getting exactly what BRICS want, which is other currencies taking the place of the dollar internationally. I don't know enough about international currency and economics to know that what I'm saying is correct, but I think that there might be some really interesting ramifications for Trump saying that he will do that might not be good for America, other than inflation from tariffs.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I don't think Trump cares what's good for America and what it isn't.
Yeah,
Trump cares.
And then there's inflation in Russia. I mean, this is an interesting thing. Again, none of us are economists, as it were, by trade, but I did at least experience the hyperinflation in Russia. I was there through the early 90s and then through 98 during the financial default crisis. And it's interesting to see, the everyday effects of that. So on the one hand, I think, yes, Russia will probably head to something that we could term economic collapse. And it will be painful, it'll be unnerving, it'll be a psychological shock to a lot of people to relive the 90s. But at the end of the day, the country did not just disappear from that. It worked its way through. Argentina hasn't disappeared as a country, and it's got, ridiculous hyperinflation. You might have to carry around a wheelbarrow load of cash. You might have to run out when you get your wages into your hand on the last Friday of the month, and run out and exchange it into dollars or whatever, or go out and buy some white goods to exchange your fast devaluing cash into something that is tradable at a later date. But people will do that. It does not translate into protest. It does not translate into anything like a political movement or a coup or anything like this. And unfortunately, I think in an authoritarian state like Russia, which has fast gone down that sort of rabbit hole of authoritarianism, not only is no one prepared to go out and do that, I think they've got plenty of examples of seeing what happens when you do. On the one hand, psychologically, they've got Maidan, which I think a lot of Russians are instinctively allergic to because of their learning from 1917 and the historic the way history was taught, to sort of fear the chaos that follows revolutions. On the other hand, they see what's unfolding in Georgia. They see what happened in Belarus and how that failed. And on the other hand, the regime have a whole bunch of techniques with which to tackle dissent. So I think, yes, we will see something that resembles economic collapse, but it will not result in societal collapse or even political change.
Well, a lot of that depends on PPP, on purchasing power parity, which is, if you understand what Russians can afford in their own economy, and then understand their GDP in terms of PPP. So people always often slag off, and this is something else I gained from that interview with Connolly on Willie OAM, is that people often look at GDP in terms of, say, the US dollar, or you try and compare countries, in one way, which is fine. But then looking at it from a different angle can sometimes give you a different perspective, which is, in terms of PPP, the Russian economy is actually like the 4th or 5th biggest economy in the world. But people always slag it off for being a much smaller economy. But actually, when you understand it in terms of what people inside Russia can afford, and there's other ways still of understanding comparatively economies against each other, and the truth will be somewhere in the middle of all these things. But I think, going back to your point, Jonathan, that if we're waiting for society to collapse from the economy collapsing, then if they're able to afford more inside, even though you're not buying stuff from outside, there are other ways to consider how things are bad for people. So if they're paying their soldiers the equivalent of like nuts amounts of money at the moment to join, then that will cause inflation, but certain people will be able to afford more. But then you've got this disparity that people often talk about, there being 4 different types of Russia, where you get all these different layers of how poor people are, going down to like the eastern regions where things really suck, and obviously for them it might be worse, but then they're less likely to get up and protest anyway. And then the elites, and then who is being affected, and these decisions that the Kremlin makes, and the international machinations of global economics will affect the different levels of Russia in different ways. But will it ever affect Russians enough for them to get up and get their pitchforks and go and attack the Kremlin? I doubt it.
And I'm going to have to push back slightly, or differ with you slightly, Jonathan, when we talk about, in particular, 98 and the devaluation of the ruble. I mean, that's when I moved to Moscow, and I do remember that if it wasn't the absolute catalyst, it was certainly one of the final nails in Yeltsin and Voloshin and the Yeltsin crowd and their control of the Kremlin. It was like, well, we cannot keep going on like this. We have to find somebody else other than Yeltsin. And then that's why there was that subsequent, those last few years before Putin was the successor, where they went through a PM, every 3-6 months in this desperate, attempt to find a successor for Yeltsin. So I think that 98
Yeltsin was clearly
well, no, I mean, I'm not,
but he was also half demented at that point, and
and
he was on the bottle. He
was a global embarrassment. He was clearly not fit for the job. But a lot of people did know that the daughters and Voloshin were kind of guiding the ship. That yes, they didn't like the embarrassment of Yeltsin, but they could kind of, there were at least as I remember it when I was in Moscow, of like, as long as the daughters was Svetlana and Tatiana and Voloshin can kind of keep the ship going. And then 98 and the collapse happened, and it was like, no, we need a completely new Kremlin. Again, I'm not saying it was the sole contributor, but 98 was devastating. I remember how really crushing that was for Russians. So it's not. I'm not going to look at a crystal ball, because there's so many variables going on right now.
True.
But I do think that this is a contributing factor, and a potential contributing factor to making the whole kind of And look, we look back in Russian history, and it's the same thing over and over and over again. People put up with it. They suffer, they suffer, they suffer, and then they can't suffer anymore, and it's violent upheaval. And then the cycle is rinse and repeat. I don't know if we're at that point with Putin, but there is this historical, record that we can look at where it gets really, really bad, and then it turns on a dime. Who knows if that's going to happen this time as well. And I don't know if it's going to be a palace coup. I don't know if it's going to be a palace coup. I don't know if the boyars are going to, circle around and say, you got to step down, or whether or not it's going to be on the streets. And if it's on the streets, it's going to be blood and lots of it. So I don't know, but
I don't buy into that one. I don't get the streets thing, because the 93, actually plenty of people are out.
I don't think the streets either. I don't.
No, I don't think either. I think there are stages in Russian history where, there are stages in Russian history where that has happened. When I went in 92 for the first time, there were, if you think of Maidan, there were little mini Maidans. I was in St. Petersburg, and the crash barriers were all piled up, huge piles of scrap. They'd taken the trams away, but trams had been toppled over, and the cobblestones ripped up to throw potentially at the riot police. So it's not that that's impossible. In Bolodna as well, it got, I believe, pretty physical there. I wasn't there, at the time of that. That was after the time of traveling.
Yeah, no.
But those days are done. I think those people.
And the violence on Bologna was. Yes, and the violence on Bologna was not particularly. I've seen worse. But the only point I'm trying to make, aside from this issue of and I agree with you, I don't think it is going to be a street level up. It's not going to be the Bolshevik. It's not going to be 1917 again. It's not going to be the Decembrists again. But I do think that the catalyst for change in Russia's history often is abrupt, because it gets to a breaking point and then transition. They're not very good at planned, kind of easing of, putting in reforms slowly, as the Arabs would say, shwaya, but it tends to happen rather abruptly. What's to paraphrase Hemingway, nothing and then all at once, suddenly and all at once. And I think there is the potential, given the way kind of Russia functions, of all of us being surprised, and maybe perhaps even the Russians themselves.
It's a shame as well that many of the people who would be prime for getting out on the streets have already got out on the streets and have either left the Russian Federation now, or they're in gulags, prisons or whatnot. So, they have a good, I don't know if it's still the case, but certainly at the beginning of the war, they had more people in their internal security services than in the armed forces. And that gives you a sense of how Russia is able to keep an iron grip on its population. And nothing would indicate that that's going to particularly change. Although there are claims that there are 200,000 down in the police forces, which gives you another indication that maybe the war has taken its toll across society. So, and there are all these different pieces of the jigsaw that I keep reporting on every day, which is like the construction industry is at the point of collapse at the moment, underwritten by the fact that no one, the interest rates have gone through the roof. People can't afford to get loans out, so therefore no one's buying property, and et cetera, et cetera. And there are lots of indications that the economic collapse is not far away. And I have fingers crossed that it does collapse, because I think that's one of the necessary components of Ukraine prevailing, is Russia being unable to sustain its war because there's an economic collapse. But whether that will actually happen, how resilient the Russian economy is, there is, as Phil said, there are so many variables. It's so difficult to predict.
I think late stage Soviet Union towards the 70s and certainly the 80s, it was a weaker form of authoritarianism than the one currently in place, because this is a good question here from Ruth Sloan. How does the losses compare to Afghanistan? Well, Russia is losing the equivalent, apparently, according to some figures, of their entire losses in Afghanistan on a near monthly basis at this point, especially since they started chucking a lot more people into Kursk to try and get that back. So it's an Afghan every month, month and a half. So the scale of the losses is extraordinary. And one must assume that at some point the scale of trauma, if people are allowed to return, and the number of wounded, the number of disabled, etc., for which Russia is really not geared up to handle and does not have, I would say, the societal values to deal with people with disability. But you potentially see less resistance to this.
Yeah, and one of the other major differences with this war is opposed to Afghanistan. Lots of people like to equate Afghanistan with America's war in Vietnam and how kind of that destabilized things. But there's another similarity in that both Americans and Russians looked at those comparative wars and said, why are we bothering with something that is so far away? This Afghanistan was far away for Russians. Yes, you can say their interests in Central Asia, but it was for the driving.
It's not part of their history, is it?
It's not part of their history. And for a Moscovite or even a Katerinberger or somebody from Peter, why are we bothering with this little mountain country so far away? What's our interest in it? Ukraine is very easy to explain to a Russian and say that that the Europe is trying to steal away our Russians. They have subdued, because they do. One of the other things that is so infuriating to me living here in Ukraine is this continued narrative out of Moscow and Russia that it is, the Ukrainians have been seduced away. It's not that they genuinely are different from us or genuinely that they are us. So it's not Afghanistan, it's us, but our poor, easily
deviant. They're just deviant Russians. They just need a good spanking, and then they'll get back on track.
I have sadly I have used this analogy many, many times before, and I'll use it again. It's the abusive boyfriend. It's I'm gonna teach you how to love me again. You're getting seduced away. The reason why you don't love me anymore is because this handsome, so-and-so has seduced you away with his, decadence and all the rest of it.
Degenerate Westerner
has come along and he's batted his eyelashes at you, and you silly, stupid, simple, farmers in Ukraine, which they still have this mentality of, these backward kind of Ukrainians. You've just been seduced away by the decadent West.
And it's not just them.
It isn't Afghanistan. This is a partner that they profess to love in this abusive relationship analogy that I'm making, that can't understand that, no, we're not like you and we don't want to be like you, but they're convinced that if they can just beat them back into loving them again, so it's not Afghanistan. This is that Western
man that's come along and seduced you, by the way, is also gay and trans at the same time. And it's like, let's just throw it all in there. Like, that's the West.
Yeah, that's chuck it all in together, right? Yeah. Exactly. And they've always hated us, and they've always resented how wonderful we are. So they're actually trying to seduce you away out of spite.
That's one of the challenges, though, isn't it? Because the more you make Russia a pariah state, right, the more you shove them away and give them what for doing X, Y, and Z, the more they get put in this corner of the world where no one likes them, but the more that feeds into their victim narrative, where they're like, that grievance narrative is like, the West always hated everyone, and it's like, this is where they live now. They've got used to living in this space where just the rest of the world hates them, but it's the rest of the world that's wrong.
Yeah, and we're insecure. Yeah. This insecure thing of like, they hate us because we're great, but then they also, in their deep down, dark deep, know that like, well, we do need to kind of change and make reforms. So, and
by the way, I do like Levi jeans.
A lot of inferiority. Yeah, exactly. Can I address Aaron's quote here, or Aaron's question here? Because I spoke to Michaela Kaleva.
I brought this up. I think this is so important. This one.
Yeah. Yeah, the first episode I did of On the Edge was purposefully done with Kuleba, because he's he does a lot of work on this front. Yes, sadly, distressingly, they take these kids and as they conquer territory and they occupy territory, they don't necessarily have to. They are taking kids. And that is really, really upsetting. And it's absolutely right that they should have been indicted in the International Criminal Court for doing this. But it's not just the kids that they take and then send out to the Far East, so there's very little chance for them to return to any kind of family. And then they put them in institutions, or they place them in families that then Russify them. But they also have been doing it as they occupy territory. They make them sing the Russian national anthem. They put them into kind of militarized Boy Scout programs, kind of a new 21st century pioneerka. And it is, and they'll do, and I don't want to be too graphic about this, because it disturbs me, and I also don't want to spread it around. But they also do stuff like they'll humiliate them on purpose to break down their will. They'll do things like strip them and take photographs and say, if you ever go against us, or if you ever do get back to Ukraine, we're going to spread these around. It's just what they do to the kids, and as far as like mental health care, it's not, they're not investing in mental health care. They're not trying to care for these kids. They make that narrative of, oh, we're saving them from the war zone, so aren't we being good guys? No, they're trying to break down their identity as Ukrainian. They oftentimes use these really awful techniques to break down their spirit, and then kind of bring them into being Russified, their own word. It is a terrible, terrible situation, and it breaks my heart. It's one of the worst things about this entire war. So it's not resettlement or mental health; it's subjugation.
It's entirely genocidal in character, and yes. That point of humiliation. If you don't really sort of understand the concept of humiliation in terms of Russian culture, then you've neither understood Russian literature nor Russian history, because humiliation is a key part of how that empire holds its people in sway. You break down people's resilience, you break down their identity, and you have to do that under duress. You have to do that under humiliation. You have to do that under extremely negative forces and pressure, so you can reprogram people with your values and to fear you and to inflict, I would say, that humiliation on each other. Because it isn't just a process of like, you got the guy down here doing this to people. No, you teach people to behave that way to each other in terms of a hierarchy of abuse, tyranny, and humiliation. That is at the very core of what we call Russian values. That is probably
I couldn't agree more.
Really understand it.
Couldn't agree more, Jonathan. And as maybe to lighten the mood a little bit, I'll throw in a little anecdote that they used to say in Moscow in the 90s. And I don't know if they still say it, but this is a good example of it. A farmer is tilling his field, and he finds the obligatory genie in the bottle. He rubs the bottle, the genie pops out. He says to the farmer, right, I'm going to give you one wish, but I need to first let you know that whatever I give to you, I'm going to give twice to your neighbor. So the farmer thinks about it for a little while, and he says, take out one of my eyes. There you go. It's as long as I know somebody else is getting it worse than me.
Yeah, that's it. That relative. Yeah, and that's such a human thing as well. Just in terms of, I don't want to go down a philosophical, theological route here, but the idea is you can justify being in a terrible position by thinking about how bad it is for how much worse it is for someone else, and that unfortunately allows all sorts of horrors for your own life. Yeah, really powerful. I wanted to ask a question. Like, this is something that I was thinking about earlier in one of my videos this morning. In that, I think because in our own domestic politics in each country that we live in supporting Ukraine, there is that competition for money, right? We've come out the back of COVID, pandemic, lots of crazy spending. There's been an energy crisis as a result of the Ukraine war, lots of crazy spending. Money is tight on the ground in a lot of countries. And we are also recognizing full well that Ukraine is in trouble and we need to support Ukraine. But in order to support Ukraine, we need to give billions. And actually, where are those billions coming from? And, are we robbing schools to pay, for Ukraine's security, et cetera, which is our security? Okay, so you got all these arguments going on. We need to sell a narrative to our electorates in all of these countries supporting Ukraine as to why it is so important to support Ukraine. And I don't think we've done a good enough job of doing that. America certainly hasn't done that. I mean, one of Biden's biggest failures is the abject inability to create a decent narrative that the population's been able to take on board really easily. I'm wondering whether we need to start telling people that we're at war much more formally. No, I don't mean a declaration of war, but like our like David Lammy in the UK has been fairly good at communicating that Russia are the bad guys and they're involved in everything. And I think I've really liked his rhetoric as a foreign minister. But I think we need to do this more often and more formally right across the nations, such that our populations really understand that Russia are the bad guys and they're involved in trying to mess up all of our elections, and they're involved in hybrid war, and that, they were behind an explosive device in Birmingham DHL warehouse. They were behind murdering of Litvinenko and the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal. They were behind, severing the cables underneath the Baltic Sea. They were behind this in Germany. They are the bad guys. We are at war with them. We are at hybrid. If you don't want to declare war, we are at hybrid war with them. But we need to tell our population that there is a clear bad guy here. I don't mean getting back to, is it a new iteration of the Cold War? I don't know. But we need to have this narrative whereby, because these guys are a massive threat, not just to our security, but actually to our democracies, we need to invest in our own defenses, but also in Ukraine to put a stop to this. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Ruta recently made a very good statement about this, is that we need to start thinking about this longer term. And I will say that, yes, our politicians need to do that. But as somebody who worked in broadcast news for over a quarter century, the international Western press has dropped the ball on this story and this and reporting on this story. I would say almost criminally, professional negligence. There are no permanent bureau to speak of, permanent bureaus, for example, in Kiev. CNN flies in and flies out. It doesn't, it's got a kind of a local skeleton staff that it keeps here, but they don't have a full bureau. They don't, there's the agencies are kind of here, but it's the journalism, Western journalism in particular, is so broken in its model, and I can say that as a veteran of the industry. We are not reporting on this. This is not front page news. The press corps is hardly here, and it's shameful that it falls to individuals, kind of freelancers, or vloggers, or what have you, that kind of come out here and do it on their own. Whether it's Zarina Zabriskie down in Kherson, or Colin, gapping on his surname, but it shouldn't be vloggers. It should be guys with resources, but it's just too expensive for the news business to be here. They would have to build up a bureau. They would have to, for insurance purposes, they would need security, and it's a cost, benefit ratio that apparently the the corporate news organizations in London or Atlanta or New York or wherever have decided that they're simply not willing to pay the cost. And again, I reiterate, I think that verges on absolute professional negligence. It's just we're not. You're right, Jonathan. You're right. We are not telling our people how really important this is, and that this war has already started. It may not be a third world war. It might be a third world war.
I think it is
in a hybrid sense. I personally do believe we're already in the third world war. But it's also there is an ideological difference when you say there are good guys and bad guys. That verges on kind of blind patriotism, like my country's right, your country's wrong. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that where do we want things to go? Because Russia presents an alternative vision of how the state relates to the citizen than is presented by the West. And we really are. And you can call me naive. You can call me kind of a zealot for Western liberal democracy. And perhaps I would admit to it. But I don't want to go down the road that Russia presents. And Russia will exert that influence well beyond its borders, where the citizen is the subject of the state. The state is the primary body that needs to push things forward. There's this quote that I use from Lincoln at every end of every episode of my show, and that is that there are these elements within liberal democracy that only pay lip service to it, whether it is MAGA or back in the day in America, the know nothings, that these guys don't really believe in liberal democracy. And if they ever do come to power, I would rather, and he writes this in 1855, I would rather move to Russia, where at least they don't pretend to have any interest in liberty. These are the options that we are being given in this conflict. And I believe that firmly. And we need to relay that to our people. If you want to go the economic route, if you want to talk about like this is going to hit your pocketbook, that's fine too. But I really think we need to relay to our people that Russia is attacking Western liberal democracy. They can't abide it. They don't want to be forced into doing it themselves. We learned that already in the 90s. We need to relay to our people, whether it's through politicians or through our media. This is an inflection point. And if Russia wins this, then things are going to go very differently in the future. And if Western liberal democracies win, it's going to go another direction. And of course, the global south is in there too.
Mark Rutte's speech, the Secretary General for NATO, his speech was absolutely on point. It's brilliant. You go out your front door now and speak to 1,000 people in your local community and ask them whether they know anything about Mark Rutte's speech, and none of them will. So my point is that some people are saying exactly the right things. But is that disseminating down to the electorate? Like, we need this very clear, all the media on board. We need this very clear sense of a narrative of what is going on. So that Mark Rutte's excellent speech is understood by the general populace. And we just don't get that. You brought up a question on the Donbass earlier, Jonathan, which I thought was an interesting one, which said something like...
Yes, that's an interesting one, wasn't it?
If the Donbass themselves came up with a survey, a poll where they would succeed to Russia, would you accept that type thing? The very simple point to that is that I wouldn't accept anything from Donbass or any occupied territory like Crimea until you had the people who have been exiled from there allowed to go back to live there. Because if you have, take the Crimea as a good example, but the same can apply to Donbass. If you have the Crimean Peninsula and the Russians annexed that, and all the pro-Ukrainians they ran away, or they were physically they were oppressed so that they escaped, they were kind of exiled, and then Russia brought in 1 million Russians into Crimea to live there. If you're going to run a referendum of what Crimeans believe should happen, you're going to get a very skewed result. And if you go, oh look, the Crimeans think it should be part of Russia, yeah, because all freaking Russians have been brought into Crimea, then that is so I don't accept any survey until you get the repopulation of those areas with the people that were living there 14 years ago. Anyway, that's my answer.
Couldn't agree more.
And indeed, there's plenty of data. I mean, if you listen to Olga Onuch, who does a lot of this sort of survey data and looks back at historical survey data to previous elections. There was not a separatist movement or a secessionist movement. There were not a bunch of MPs elected to the Verkhovna Rada under the remit of seceding from Ukraine. It just wasn't a thing until it was imposed on that territory. Yes, there were various issues. Yes, Russian was in the process of being classed for administrative purposes, not as the primary language of some business of government, but it's incredibly nuanced. And, you know, in a normal country, if this country wasn't on the borders of a mafia gas station, mafia run territory that really has no citizenry to speak of, you would look at this in a very different light. You would say, well, no, hang on a second. No, of course, you know, it's a sovereign country and it needs to sort its own problems out. And of course, it's not going to be absent of problems. We have numerous problems in every single European country. We have numerous territories that actually have different histories from, you know, the entity that they're part of now. In Scotland, you know, there've been a referendum on this very subject. So you can run these processes according to constitutional, you know, requirements. Obviously, in Spain, a contentious issue, but you know that kind of referendum wasn't allowed, and there was all sorts of unpleasantness there with various minority sort of communities. But you need to work this out in the context of a sovereign country. Somebody coming in and imposing essentially a made-up fictitious solution on a problem that they've also manufactured largely. That's you know, we need to call that out. I think one of the challenges we've got is you're talking about, you know, telling our populations that this, you know, the state we're in and what Russia's intent is. The trouble is, we go back to 2014, that wasn't done then. It wasn't stated unequivocally. Crimea is not sovereign Russian territory. This is illegal. This goes against everything that the post-World War II order stands on. Kuwait, the first Gulf War, happened because of territorial infringement by one dictatorship of another country. It doesn't matter whether it's a sovereign democracy or not. There is a sanctity to international recognized borders. We, in some ways, many people, and that includes a lot of academics and people, just fudged it. And in some cases, they actually accepted the Russian imperialist arguments, which is ironic, given that many of the people who would trot this kind of stuff out, either consciously or unconsciously, repeating Russian imperial narratives around Crimea, are sort of left-leaning. So it really doesn't make any sense at all, unfortunately. But in the absence of facts, in the absence of context, in the absence of knowledge, and in the face of a very malicious informational machine, we've been proved wanting.
Yeah, and this argument that is made and seems to be adopted by so many in the West of like, well, they're Russian speakers, so obviously they are pro Moscow. I mean, they're these Eastern, whether it's Kharkiv or Odessa, where they generally speak Russian. Well, of course they're going to be aligned with Russia. Well, go to Donegal and tell them that they are a subject of the king.
I'm invading the United States next week because it's all mine, by the way.
Exactly right.
I'm going to take it all myself. There's a really good point by TOI that says Crimea isn't part of the Russian Federation anymore, than the northern part of Ireland is part of the UK. Planted population should have no say in constitutional issues. Now, this is fascinating because this then starts getting into like a really sticky situation, because at some point, people live in a place long enough that they do become part of that place, and you can't then extract them and put them back or ignore them. And so, the question is, well, now Northern Ireland, do we just take the Scottish Protestants that were brought in there by Britain and then pick them up and take them back to Scotland? No, we can't do that. So, like, at some point, it does get too late to do that. But we're hopefully still in this situation now where if there was an end to this war fairly soon, then we could sort out the Crimean problem there, so that it doesn't become, 50 years later, 100 years later, a Northern Ireland where you can't solve that problem in the same way. And
we're talking about living memory.
I've heard that a lot.
Grandparents were expelled. People's grandparents were expelled after the Second World War, persecuted throughout the Soviet Union, and then obviously 2014 has resulted in another wave of suppression and the implanting of let's say a non-native population on that. I think if it's within that familial memory, then you need to be able to deal with that. If someone could say, hang on a second, this was my house, I lived here, I grew up here, my grandparents, if you can actually get that documentary record within a generation, then I think it's an open question. Whereas it's pretty difficult to litigate stuff from the 16th, 17th, 18th century, even the 19th. But when it's within the lifetime of people living.
I have heard that sentiment here from Ukrainians, and also throughout, Ukraine, where there is an opinion, and it's not a small percentage, saying, look, if you were 10 years old in 2014 in Luhansk or Donetsk, or the sections that were occupied, you're now 20, and you have heard nothing but what Moscow wants you to hear and learn and be. That is distinctly different, however, and let us all keep in mind that Russia did not take all of those oblasts, so we're really only talking about the occupied areas of those oblasts. But then also to add to that and to support what you just said, Jonathan, Zaporizhia and Kherson, swallowing that pill and saying, well, they've been absorbed into Russian, so now they're now Russian, is ludicrous. And also completely unacceptable to most of the Ukrainians that I speak to. But there is a section of this country that is, and it may be the exhaustion of the war, but who do say, well, they've been indoctrinated for over a decade. They're kind of lost to us already. So.
And I would, if this was my own stream, then spend 45 minutes talking about the philosophy of this, because there's a great thought experiment called the Socrates paradox, which is, when does a sand dune become not a sand dune? Sometimes it's called the theory of a beard. If you keep taking hair out of your beard, when does it become not a beard? So you take a grain of sand off a sand dune, and there's no definable demarcation line where it goes from sand dune to no sand dune. But the problem is, the paradox is, you end up getting to a point where there are no grains of sand, and it's still a sand dune. And you're like, well, that's a paradox. Okay, so the point is that when you have a continuum of time, or a continuum of anything, lines are often arbitrary, and there's no definitive demarcation point, and we kind of have to fumble around and work out the answer. And so, how long is the amount of time you have to leave before it becomes unfair to give Crimea back to, or so on and so forth. So, there is no objective answer, and life is just really complex, and we have to argue to toss over things. And unfortunately, we don't have simple answers that fall out of the sky for us. And that's a problem of finding a demarcation line. Like, when can we still give Crimea back to Ukraine if it had been occupied, like 20 years, 30 years, 50, 5,
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a reason why I didn't include Crimea in my analogy with Donetsk and Lugansk, because, if you really want to start picking at that scab, it's really maybe the Turks or the Tatars.
I
mean, it's just, where do you stop? So that's why I distinctly didn't include Crimea in my example of Lugansk and Donetsk.
Yeah.
And also, by the way,
it wasn't
as
that
a foreigner, I think the Sons of Liberty in 1776 would disagree with you, but I am also just expressing this as what I hear here in Ukraine. As a foreigner, as an American who is a guest in this country, it is not for me to say, but I have heard this expressed repeatedly by a lot of people about Donetsk and Lugansk and those occupied territories, because the propaganda and the mental manipulation of the population in those occupied territories going on a decade now is so influential that, are they Ukrainian anymore? I mean, this is what I'm hearing on the ground. Not my position, but again, it's not for me to say. I'm a guest.
And there will be many individuals there, of course, who are under duress. There are many individuals who are fully aware of their Ukrainianness and the sense of repression. I mean, if the war is to be frozen, one would hope those people could leave or have the opportunity to leave, which of course they can't at the moment, or express any of those sentiments. There are plenty of Ukrainians with family and relatives behind that, that line.
And this is also adjacent to the people of Mariupol, who you see spread throughout this country. The internally displaced people of Mariupol, who, and also if you want to talk about the folks who have fled abroad and left Ukraine entirely, the longer that they are out of, say, Mariupol, or indeed, out of Ukraine itself, how much longer will it be as they start to build lives? Will they return if there were to be a settlement which would allow them to return?
And that's how Russia does empires.
Bingo.
Yeah, so it does empires. They're not a naval empire like Britain. We sail around the world and whack a flag in a country and go, hey, it turns out you're ours now. Like the Russians, they will just move out from their territory and assimilate and intermarry and it's more of a creep, and that becomes very difficult to undo. That is a great question, by the way.
And the brutality.
This is a great question because a very simple answer, if I may, to this, which is it's not surprising that overt commies and Nazis support Putin, but what explains Israel supporters also supporting Putin, like Ann Coulter, Michael Savage, and Rebel News, etc. The simple answer is Judeo-Christian prevalence in the United States, for example, whereby the Israel conflict is now become a crusade against Islam, and the people in so many politicians in the US are driven by either virtue signaling for Judeo-Christianity or actual, driven by their theology, such that war is effectively part of a crusade. And those people can hold at the same time that supporting Israel in their war against whoever in that neck of the woods is justifiable, but supporting Ukraine is not okay, because one is a completely different domain to the other. One's geopolitical and the other's almost theological. That's my answer to that.
I think we have to have a quick reminder, of course, to people. We are going to be wrapping things up shortly, but before you go, please do check out the donation link. All three of us are involved in this fundraiser to try and get trucks to Ukraine. They will be refitted. They will be tested for their battle worthiness, and armor will be added to protect the limbs of the drivers. These are essential pieces of equipment to help Ukrainians get essential supplies to the front and get stuff back, including sometimes wounded people, to get them back to frontline medical points and so on. So these are absolutely essential pieces of equipment. We know that drone warfare is exacting a terrible toll on these kind of machines, because anything that moves anywhere close to the front line is now a target for drone warfare. And it's not just the Ukrainians who've mastered that. Of course, unfortunately, we know the Russians have some capability and scale at that, of course, supported by China, it has to be said. And as we proceed, it seems that China is blocking more and more of the components that Ukrainians relied on from the supply chain, or at least not blocking them to the Russian side, but blocking them from the Western Ukrainian side. So these trucks are actually essential pieces of kit. Before we wrap it up, though, Jonathan,
can I
think
just, so Jonathan,
you've explained this to your audience. Yes, please.
So someone on that Israel point, there's another really important point which actually Faystar has brought up. He says, I disagree, JP. I disagree, JP. Israel has become a US ally for a very long time. There is also a very important component in that there's actually a formal alliance with Israel. There are in a sense, the US is kind of contractually obliged to help Israel as well. So that is worth remembering. So there's a cultural thing, and there's a kind of a political or an agreement thing as well. Although, we can all
minor or maybe not so minor difference in opinion in that there is a written document between our nations as well.
Yeah.
The Budapest Agreement, there's ink on paper and signatures are there. So we do have an obligation.
Conveniently forgotten. Yeah. I use this
Obligation,
argument
but-
so often against Americans that say we've got nothing to do with Ukraine. It's like you've literally signed up to the Budapest
There's ink on paper.
Memorandum.
I always say, and that always contrasts with those who say, well, yeah, but on the sidelines of this agreement or that agreement, we gave assurances that, NATO wouldn't move east, which to start with is a misnomer. I don't want to go down that road. But for me, I have
it's completely
always
false.
said,
Let's put it out there. It's completely false.
It's completely
There's nothing
false.
in
It's completely false
whatsoever.
There's nothing. No, but that's the point. That's the point. That's the point. And also, whatever was said between, say, what is it? Who was the foreign the Secretary of State at the time that they always mentioned had said this to Gorbachev that we won't move these. Well, it's a completely different concept. And also, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's all just talk. My point is this: the point that this member of the chat is making, which in that there is agreements and there's there is an alliance, or there's solid agreements between Israel and America. Well, there is ink on paper, and until there is and sign and signatures are put on dotted lines, I don't care what was said about this, that, or that. We have an obligation to Ukraine because we put ink on paper.
But if you're the world powers, who holds you to account for not? So if I don't, I'm going to use this argument to go into my
Who
bank
watches
and say,
the watchers?
Yeah, I'm going to go into my bank and say, well, I've got a piece of paper with my signature on here for the mortgage, but I'm not going to pay it. And then the bank come back and take my house. I'm like, oh, that didn't work very well. So, but in terms of like the US having a signed agreement with Ukraine, like who holds you? Like, there's no one that's going to come to the US and go, well, we're going to take back your house now. Like, so you have these agreements, but if you're the top of the hegemonic kind of strata in the world, then who holds you to account for not doing that? The only thing that happens is that you lose trust.
Not a small thing, though.
It's also not defined, is it? I mean, one of the problems is it's not defined what we will do and under what circumstances we'll do it. So there's no definition there, and you can either wriggle out of it, or you can say, well, I mean, it didn't make allowance for this particular thing. Maybe queuing up, tomorrow's chat or later in the week. Article 5, apparently, I was speaking to Keir Charles at a recent event. Article 5 is not particularly specific about when allies come to each other's aid, and that shows that Russia can escalate in the grey zone up to what is quite an ill-defined kind of red line. Well, that's probably a whole other can of worms that we can open up later in the week. It's worth telling everybody here who's on here that we're going to be running one of these daily, 1 o'clock. We're going to have different guests each day. We're going to unpack a whole load of topics. We're going to meander in all sorts of directions, and we are going to take our cue from the comments that are placed. And I think today we've had some fantastic comments in there. We obviously haven't got to all of them, but we're going to do this until we've got a bunch of trucks.
Hear, hear.
Absolutely. Yep. Let's do it until we've got a bunch of trucks. That's the maxim for Jonathan Fig. I'm going to do this till I've got a bunch of trucks.
A whole bunch of trucks. And I believe, Jonathan, you've made a certain commitment to on how these are going to be delivered.
Oh, yes. So
you're gonna help.
Hopefully, if they are bought in the UK, and I don't know that's a promise, but I think most of their trucks, or a lot of their trucks, do come from the UK, as we've got a pretty good market for that, although I imagine that's getting pretty exhausted at the moment. Then I live in the UK. Jonathan lives in the UK. We can do Phil is apparently a UK citizen, so I found out earlier. But he's not living in the UK at the moment, so he cannot join us on this convoy. And I know I've got JR and Benny Pie who are wanting to join me on the convoy. If we have 2 trucks and you have 1 truck, then that's a convoy of 3 trucks. That's a convoy in my definition. So let's do it. Drive ourselves out.
Let's definitely do that. Well, we're going to come back to this each day. We're going to be reminding people. We want to source at least 1. But there's a little bit of internal competition going here. I think, Jonathan, by the end of the week, will probably have covered the price of several. We may need some additional drivers as well, but we'll keep you up to date on that campaign.
Little friendly competition is not a bad thing.
And have you guys got any streams or any episodes you want to advertise before we log off?
All my videos every day.
Yeah, and I do a kind of a more formal sit down in studio interview program that I broadcast or that I publish every Sunday at 8 p.m. Kiev time, which I believe is 1800 London or 10 in the morning Pacific time. So we're trying to keep to a regular schedule of that, and we try to get different voices, either Ukrainian, Russian, or anybody who has particular insight. So every Sunday on the Edge, out on my YouTube channel, which is just simply my name.
Awesome. And I'd love to have Phil on mine at some point. I've got a thing going on at the moment where, because all numbers are arbitrary and so are dates. I'm trying to get to 50,139, but now that I've said this enough, it's no longer an arbitrary number. So I should really be changing number every day. But anyway, 50,139 subscribers by the 2nd of January. And that is my arbitrary goal that I'm setting. And I'm not looking like I'm going to get it unless you guys can get out there and just subscribe to my YouTube channel. It doesn't make any difference. So just in case you're wondering, it's like self-fulfilling and it's trying to make me more money or anything like that. Subscribers, actually, your algorithm throws things into you just on what you watch. Subscribers actually has very little effect on anything for anyone who cares about YouTuber stuff out there. But I said that it's just a random goal and I want to reach it, just so I can say I've got 50,139 subscribers. So come on, guys, help me.
Absolutely. That's all I have to say. Get up to that. Get to that magic number and get the little trophy as well. I think that'll be a target for the end of next year. Guys, it's been absolutely brilliant. I look forward to the next one. Everybody who's still logged on, please do help us to get those trucks in. We'll be making videos about that as well, so you'll get to see the full journey of how those are delivered. You'll get to see the people who are renovating them to make them battle worthy, and meeting some of the characters who have dedicated their lives to helping Ukraine, helping their country to survive. And I think that will be inspiring to see. Phil, Jonathan, delighted to see you here, and can't wait till the next time.
I'm gonna go start plugging batteries back in, because God knows how much longer I'm gonna have electricity. Jonathan, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you very much, guys. Always a pleasure, never a chore.